A very good evening to all, and thanks to Overman Foundation once again. So, we have been discussing the movement of English poetry, and as we move on to the next stage in the literary history of England, the latter half of the 19th century, which is popularly and better known as the Victorian Age, we find that it is characterized by a dominant note of intellectualism. And this is something not unencountered before. We have seen how intellectualism has been the bane of true poetry in the hands of 18th century English poets. But the 19th century saw the flourishing of a different note of intellectualism, the imaginative, artistic type, and did not draw much upon the dry and sterile intellectualism of its predecessors. Touched by greater, wider thoughts, aesthetic, refined, the poetry of the Victorian age is more alive, astir, inspired, and gives us some high and rare moments of great poetry and also some moments of prophecy. Following Sri Aurobindo's great commentary on the Victorian age or 19th century in general, we are first reminded of its basic characteristics. In this age, there were great upheavals in almost all fields, with the great flood of free thinking, free inquiry, scientific and political enthusiasm, artistic vivacity conquering almost the whole continent. But Sri Aurobindo says all these swept past the English shores. Only an insignificant wave or two touched the land. While much was happening around the world in those times, England witnessed the most unlovely and uninspiring period of its spirit, according to Sri Aurobindo. And to continue in Sri Aurobindo's words, here is a description of Victorian England as a period of smug commercial middle class prosperity, hard utilitarianism, shoddy liberalism, narrow practical rationality, spiritual poverty, and intellectual ineptitude. Evidently, art and literature were bound to come under and imbibe this kind of influence. Overall, it was a depression, especially in the field of poetry into which the English spirit had fallen. And here, let me explain with the poetic imagery of Sri Aurobindo, who makes us think of Victorian literature as a well cultured flatness. That is a kind of depression, a hollow. And this hollow is flanked by beautiful mountain ranges both behind and in front of it. That probably defines and gives a near accurate picture of the descent of literature, especially poetry in this age. And the magic hills behind was the great English Romantic period, and the sea horizons in front are the creations of the modern poets who were to succeed the Victorian poets. And Sri Aurobindo further says that this descent from the magic heights of the Romantics was very sudden, which was less of a revolt than a transition to other varied modes and interests. So now let us see what were the gains and the losses of this abrupt change of levels. So we can say Victorian poetry affords us much to stimulate and admire, but nothing to take us to the summits of poetic enthusiasm. And by way of comparison, Sri Aurobindo shows us how the beauty of Keats is replaced by mere picturesqueness in Tennyson, or how the personal force of Byron is replaced by the intellectual robustness of Browning. The kind of descent of level is more evident in the moralizing tone of Arnold, which replaced the romantic ethical turn of Wordsworth, or the glamour and languorous dream of Rossetti and Morris, which came in place of the supernatural visions of Blake and Coleridge. And Swinburne's, and here I must use Sri Aurobindo's brilliant phrase, Swinburne's turgid lyrical surge and foam tossing sound was hardly a good substitute for the ethereal lyricism of Shelley. So we see the loss was in spiritual substance. And in the fall from the heights of inspiration, there was a paucity of greatness and insufficient profundity in the intellectual effort of the poets. Added to these failures was the misfortune of Philistinism which reigned England in mid 19th century. Though English language gained from a fuller and more varied use of it, and there was varied range of thought and interest displayed in its conscious creative products, yet, on the whole, the Victorian age, according to Sri Aurobindo, is not one of the great humanistic ages which the world may look back to with a sense of clarity or uplifting. Um, the Victorian writers were the forerunners of an enriched, more conscious artistic creation, but themselves imbibed the air of the common and the mediocre. Of course, exceptions are always there, but generally the poetry of the Victorian age suffers by the smoke laden atmosphere in which it worked and flourished. The general impression the age gives is, therefore, of a poverty in thought, a sense of something not done, though in some poets, in their exalted moments, beauty and energy of poetic creation can be glimpsed. And in Sri Aurobindo's words, and I'm quoting, the inner surge and satisfaction of a free or deep spirit, the strong high riding pinion or the skyward look, these things are rare in Victorian poetry, unquote. So let us now see what the age against such a background has to offer us in and through the works of individual poets. And we may well begin with Alfred Tennyson, who was the representative poet of the Victorian age, and in whose works is reflected all the art and taste and temperament of the Victorians. But here there is not any great outburst or uplifting either in the lyrical or the epic mode. What we have in Tennyson, rather, is a great power of speech which increased the intrinsic value of the thought expressed, felicitated the pictorial with elaborate poetic devices. So, undoubtedly, Tennyson was a consummate master where language was concerned, as we witness in his leisurely flow of words in poetry. And easy elaborateness, picturesqueness, opulent form are the characteristic Tennysonian qualities, and these could easily attract the cultured elite but not baffle the ordinary man. So basically, what we get from this master craftsman is a picture of the general, popular, well established, and well accepted ideas and thoughts. So, what still makes Tennyson the great poet he is? It is the charm he lends to this description by his manner of speech, which makes the ordinary seem to belong to greater motives. It is an admirable achievement, but which captivates the outer aesthetic mind but hardly satisfies the inner spirit. Okay, consider this melodious verse from one of his very well known poems, and he writes, sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no mourning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. The lines are melodious, no doubt. But as we have briefly discussed earlier, he was more preoccupied with the externalities of life. So ultimately, we do not get anything extraordinary here, and that may be due to incompatibility in intention and method. If there was in Tennyson any intention to convey something higher, something spiritual, through use of ancient myths and legends, this was thwarted by his inability to recreate these to fit the new context and give them a permanent symbolic significance. So, Tennyson's fame and value as a poet is liable to suffer in future, which may not place him on as high a pedestal as his contemporaries had done. And consider some of Tennyson's memorable creations. But we have to see how the general characteristics apply to all these. For instance, his Idylls of the King, about which Sri Aurobindo says that it is reduced to a triviality, with no power of life and a glaring incongruity between form and symbol, and also feeling and substance. The fault of Tennyson was not so much in the selection of the material as his handling of them. He chose magic figures of old legend and romance, but used them to convey a sentimentalism of Victorian domesticity and social ethics. Evidently, the ancient legendary figures were not suited for this kind of a frame. And to quote Sri Aurobindo's words again, modernism and the affectation of materialism, conventional reality and the falsetto tones of pseudo romance destroy each other and produce a glittering incongruity. Unquote. So, not only this, other works of Tennyson also suffer from lack of poetic vision or a revealing grasp on life. Some earlier works, like, say, Morte d'Arthur or other poems, fare a little better perhaps. But even here we see the form exceeds the substance, and Tennyson can hardly escape from the confines of the conventional Victorian mind. And Sri Aurobindo says he is not basically a lyrical poet, and his description of nature is also a little more than a painting of details and serves more to decorate and beautify the poem. The sincere response to and deeper communion with nature, as we had in the earlier generation of poets, this is absent here. So, Sri Aurobindo calls him a great poetical craftsman and not a revealing poetical thinker. So, let us listen to Tennyson for an explanation of these labels. In one of his very well known poems, The Lotus Eaters, he writes, "In the afternoon they came unto a land in which it seemed always afternoon. All round the coast the languid air did swoon, breathing like one that hath a weary dream. Full faced above the valley stood the moon, and like a downward smoke the slender stream along the cliff to fall and pause and fall did seem." So, great imagery over here. Or look at the opening lines of Inoni, where Tennyson writes, "There lies a vale in Ida lovelier than all the valleys of Ionian hills. The swimming vapour slopes athwart the glen, puts forth an arm, and creeps from pine to pine, and loiters slowly drawn. On either hand, the lawns and meadow ledges midway down hang rich in flowers, and far below them rose the long brook falling through the cloven ravine in cataract after cataract to the sea." So, very pictorial again, and we have all kinds of imageries over here, visual, auditory, all. But there is a note of artificiality creeping in, perhaps because of the excess of ornamentation and coloring of form with comparatively inadequate substance. And when we say Tennyson is a representative poet of his age, it may be good to remember that at best he represents the cultivated, fixed, acceptable ideas of the times. In Sri Aurobindo's words, Tennyson renders in poetry the liberalism, conservatism, common doubt, traditional belief, and formal ethicism. But what is absent is true passion. But Tennyson, nevertheless, has stamped the English language with his own artistic, decorative style and even given the starting points in poetic creation which may be used by poets of greater power to use to greater purpose. Okay, so let us now turn to another poet of the Victorian age, Swinburne. In Swinburne, we have something individual and unique. He brings uncommon things to English poetry. Where there is in him fire and passion, there is also the continental influence with its note of denial. There's also the atheistic affirmation and political idealism. Of course, the Anglo Celtic aggressiveness denominates all these various tones in the poet. Now, Swinburne, of course, was very musical, a great lyricist, but what mars his lyrical thought is its excess and thus an inequality in inspiration and tone. His earlier poetry has the noble qualities of marvelous music and sensual appeal and beauty and a near perfect workmanship. And Sri Aurobindo mentions works like Hertha, Dolores, Garden of Proserpine as examples of consummate achievements of English poetry. So let us listen to some lines from Swinburne. And the poet writes, before ever land was, before ever the sea, or soft hair of the grass, or fair limbs of the tree, or the fresh colored fruit of my branches, I was, and thy soul was in me. Beside or above me, naught is there to go. Love or unlove me, unknow me or know. I am that which unloves me and loves. I am stricken and I am the blow. So it's from Heart, a very beautiful poem, and lovers of poetry may read the whole poem. But all this, the melodious voice, the voice of revolt, high lyrical sentiment, all these get diffused and exhausted too soon, perhaps, leaving Swinburne's later works quite empty of significance. So let's turn to another poet. That is, next to Tennyson, Robert Browning is one poet who represents his age, but far surpasses Tennyson in sheer mass and variety. For in Browning we have abundant form, range, inventiveness, theme, and he has made a study of almost every human situation and every possible human personality and character. And even when writing in the Victorian period, he has scanned and drawn his characters from various ages and periods of history. And Sri Aurobindo makes this invaluable comment about Robert Browning that nothing human is foreign to his research and pursuit. And anyone who is acquainted with Browning literature cannot agree more. Look at these poems like Fra Lippo, Andrea del Sarto, Bishop Bloom's Apology, Rabbi Ben Ezra, My Last Touches, and many others. These are each a brilliant and probing study of the human mind and soul, revealing his keen, inexhaustible interest in man. Okay, so I'm quoting some lines from this poem, Bishop Bloom's Apology, where the bishop questions his doubt, faith, unbelief, and we'll see these can be the questions of any man, anywhere. And he says, if once we choose belief on all accounts, we can't be too decisive in our faith, conclusive and exclusive in its terms, to suit the world which gives us the good things. In every man's career are certain points whereon he dares not be indifferent. The world detects him clearly, if he dares, as baffled at the game and losing life. So it's a long, long poem and a brilliant character study. But sadly, we get very little of poetry here. Consider these lines from Andrea del Sarto, the faultless painter, but a failure in other spheres. He speaks in anguish and remorse, and I've quoted at random from the poem, where he's saying, a common grayness silvers everything. Days decrease and autumn grows, autumn in everything. Love, we are in God's hand. How strange now looks the life He makes us lead. So free we seem, so fettered fast we are. I feel He laid the fetter, let it lie. Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? So, note the moralizing tone of the poem. So, we see Browning's creations surpass and give us much more than his contemporaries did. His poetry thus affords us unceasing interest in it, as was the poet's own unceasing interest in the study of man. He seems to expound in his works the creed of Alexander Pope's the proper study of mankind is man. As a narrator of the drama of human life, Browning's achievement is remarkable in wit and innovativeness. And Sri Aurobindo says he is the one robust and masculine voice among his contemporaries. Browning had his own assured convictions and beliefs, and a vigorous hold on life, but was exceptionally free of mere conventionality. Of course, he does represent, and perhaps solely, the critical and exploring Victorian mind, more than the idealist and dreamer, like many of his contemporaries were. Browning was a psychologist, a critic, a thinker, and an ardent student of human nature, which included human aims, ambitions, and longings and yearnings, and also human failures. Though he was a narrator of the ways of human life, he chose the dramatic mode, as that was where his genius lay. He specialized in and has perfected the mode of the dramatic monologue, where his method is to seize on a critical moment of the soul or mind of the character and follow its convolutions into the dramatic impulse. Let us look at an example. The rejected lover, in his very popular poem, The Last Ride Together, is caught in a crucial moment of his final dismissal in love, and he exclaims, since all my life seemed meant for fails, since this was written and needs must be, my whole heart rises up to bless your name in pride and thankfulness. Take back the hope you gave, I claim only a memory of the same. What need to strive with a life awry? So, this is how he is accepting the situation. And then follows his philosophizing on material success and failure, culminating in the self assured belief and hope of an afterlife. And then he says, still, one must lead some life beyond, have a bliss to die with, dim descried. Now, while this kind of philosophizing is one way of accepting the destined, one way of accepting fate. There can be an opposite reaction too of the human mind in a similar situation. And this is dramatized in another one of Browning's poems called Porphyria's Lover, where the lover is shown in the spine chilling act of strangling and killing Porphyria with her own tresses of hair round her neck. So, in power and hold of his material and language, in the range of his creations, in forcible expression, Browning was akin to the great Shakespeare himself. But what he lacked was artistic form and poetic beauty. And unlike Shakespeare, Browning's language is vivid and prosaized and came more from the intellect rather than the imagination. The lyric elevation and grace and rich poetic beauty are there, but these are rare in Browning and do not elevate the mass of his poetic work to a high level. So, Browning's work is forceful, and though he is a great creator, he is not a great artist or poet because Sri Aurobindo says the supreme greatness cannot come in poetry without the supreme beauty. Okay, so now let us turn to another poet of the Victorian era who takes us back into the true classical style. He's Matthew Arnold. Now, Arnold resembles the earlier poets in his simple and straightforward diction, power of thought, strength of language, and reflective ideas. And in some ways, Arnold can be placed above many of his contemporaries. He is free from Victorian conventionalities. He can be romantic sometimes, can be classical, and according to Sri Aurobindo, he creates the impression of the truest poetry. Arnold's speech is adequate and has an elevated force. Though not bound by Victorian conventions, Arnold yet expressed in and through his poetry the characteristic Victorian temperament and contemporary train of thought in the best way possible. And in a way, he anticipates some future trends too, especially in metrical forms. And he also anticipates much of the problems that is psychological and mental of modern life. So let's listen to Arnold in one of his very popular poems, Dover Beach. He's saying, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." Now, these lines, I suppose, are relevant for the modern man also. So, this was Arnold, and there are several other poets also of the Victorian era who brought yet different elements to its poetry. Say Rossetti, his poetry has a note of what Sri Aurobindo calls the aesthetic mysticism and medievalism, which contributed in its own special way to enrich the mosaic of Victorian literature. So here are some lines from one of his very beautiful poems, The Cloud Confines. He says, "The day is dark and the night, to him that would search their heart. No lips of cloud that will part, nor morning song in the light. Only gazing alone to him wild shadows are shown, deep under deep unknown, and height above unknown height. Still we say as we go, strange to think by the way, whatever there is to know, that shall we know one day." So this was Rossetti. And there's another poet, Morris, another poet who was writing during those times, and he moves away from the conventional track and blatant Victorian environment to take us into the charming world of old legends and stories. And he assigns himself simple tasks and fulfills himself in these. In his poem, The Earthly Paradise, therefore, he says, "Of heaven or hell I have no power to sing. I cannot ease the burden of your fears, or make quick coming death a little thing. or bring again the pleasure of past years, nor for my words shall ye forget your tears, or hope again for aught that I can say, the idle singer of an empty day. But rather, when aweary of your mirth, from full hearts still unsatisfied ye sigh, and feeling kindly unto all the earth, grudge every minute as it passes by, made the more mindful that the sweet days die. Remember me a little then, I pray, the idle singer of an empty day. The lines are very beautiful. So Morris and Rossetti, along with Arnold, were studious artists, and even with their small contribution, helped in the enrichment of poetic language and thought and artistic feeling. And as Sri Aurobindo says, brought into English poetry a turn for fine execution. So let's look at another example from Arnold again, where he's saying, this is the curse of life, that not a nobler, calmer train of wiser thoughts and feelings blot our passions from our brain. But each day brings its petty dust, our soon choked souls to fill, and we forget because we must and not because we will. So the neatness of the verse and the thoughts is quite remarkable over here. So these were the few poets of the Victorian era. And to sum up, we can say that the Victorian age, as reflected in the works of its poets, is balanced on contradictory and sometimes conflicting elements. Where we have the England's poet laureate Tennyson voicing the conventional Victorian thought, Swinburne comes with his high pitched cry of revolt. Arnold also poeticizes the serious notes of Victorian thinking, while Rossetti and Morris fall back upon medievalism to sing out their thoughts. Overall, there was an ungenial atmosphere in which the poetry of the Victorian age was written. In spite of occasional failure or imperfection of form and substance, there was considerable enrichment of language, and the intellectual and artistic endeavor helped in the creation of an artistic conscience, as Sri Aurobindo says. And I may conclude this talk also in Sri Aurobindo's own words when he says that the Victorian age may be remembered as a fine, if limited, period of preparation for the discovery of new, more beautiful, and grander fields of poetry. Unquote. We have perhaps not entered those grander fields yet, but can have a glimpse of its beauty in the works of the modern poets, which shall be our topic of discussion in the next talks. So, thank you so much.